Hello there, Audrey-Ann here from LiveSnapLove.com, where I teach you the ins and outs of your camera so you can beautifully capture your family and your everyday life. And in today's video tutorial, we are going to be talking about 5 reasons why your images aren't turning out the way that you want. So I know that it can be incredibly disheartening. You pour your heart and soul into learning photography, and it doesn't matter what you do, you still can't seem to capture images the way that you see them, or you can see them in your head. And I know it's that disheartening because I've been there too. So I'm going to give you today 5 different reasons why you can't seem to capture those images. And the key to everything you hear here today is action. So please don't just sit there and be an armchair photographer. Go get out there and take some of these suggestions on board so you can start to capture the images that you want. So let's kick things off now with the first reason, which is you don't know how to set the correct exposure for the scene that you're photographing. So there are generally 2 types of photographers that fall into this category. Those who are still shooting on full automatic mode and those who are on one of the semi-automatic modes like aperture priority. So let's just rewind a little bit and just talk about what exposure is. So exposure is simply how light or how dark your image is. And we control exposure through 3 different elements: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. When we're in auto, our camera chooses all 3 of these settings, and it also decides how light or how dark our image is going to be. Now, that's a problem because your camera cannot see light the way that we can. It also doesn't know what area of the scene you want to be perfectly exposed. Let's just say you have the sun behind your subject, and when you're taking an image of them, the camera will just look at all the light in the scene. It will see all that bright background and it will try and darken it down. And what you'll end up with is an underexposed subject. When really what we want to tell the camera is, don't worry about that background. This is the area of the scene that I want to be perfectly exposed. Now, in one of the semi-automatic modes like aperture priority mode, you still have the same problem. Although you're choosing 1 or maybe 2 of the elements of exposure, let's say aperture and ISO, you're still leaving the camera to determine and decide on the final exposure. You might get a technically correct exposure, but that varies greatly from getting the optimal exposure for the scene that you're trying to photograph. So since you don't get the control in auto or in aperture priority mode, the only thing left to do is switch to shooting in manual mode. Understanding each setting and how to expose correctly for the scene is key to getting images to look the way that you want them to. Now let's move on to our second reason, which is you don't understand light. So light is another key element to getting a great photograph. It is that special ingredient that can lift a bland everyday moment and turn it into something more interesting and a work of art. And it can work the other way too. If you think your images are bland and uninteresting, then the chances are you're using bland and uninteresting light. And this actually ties back into manual mode because you tend not to shoot in these more dramatic lighting situations because you can't get your exposure the way that you want them to. Once you can use manual mode, you can start to experiment with more dramatic lighting situations. Low light, pockets of light, backlight, or golden hour. And that's when you start to get images that are correctly exposed and have that more dramatic professional look to them because you're using your light more effectively. So now on to my third reason, which is simply that you're going too fast. So another thing you can do to start getting that images you see in your head is to actually simply slow down. If you're one of those people that come into the scene and immediately start snapping because you're scared of missing a moment, I would encourage you to actually take a few minutes or even just a few moments up front to think about what you're photographing and what you want to capture. Think about where the light is coming from, how that's hitting your subject, where's the best place for you to stand. Which settings should you use? Is there any compositional elements in the frame that you can use, or any distractions in the background? Just taking that few moments up front will mean that your images turn out with a lot more thought and care. So unless you're photographing a moment that you can never get back again, I suggest that you spend a little bit time up front getting everything right. You might miss 1 or 2 shots, but the ones you get after that will more than make up for it. Let's move on now to our next reason, which is simply that you don't know your camera well enough. So I totally get it seems a little bit daunting to learn all the functions of your camera because there's so many buttons and dials and functions and menus that it can be a little bit overwhelming at first. But as we've just heard, taking over exposure yourself and manually setting that rather than letting the camera do it for you is one key element of getting a good photo. But so is other things. For example, you want to take control of your own focus. You want to take control of the own color in your images, not letting your camera decide all of these for you. And once you learn all these settings, I promise it just takes seconds to set up your camera before you start shooting. And once you take control of these and you understand them yourself, it leaves you free to think about other things like using interesting light and getting better composition. So let's move on now to our 5th and final reason, which is you think gear is the most important element. So when I first started learning photography, I was definitely more interested in gear than I was about learning photography. I would be obsessed about camera bodies and thinking that upgrading would give me better images. Or I'd look at my favorite photographers and see which lenses they use to get certain shots. Now, don't get me wrong, gear is important, but it's nowhere near as important as learning your craft. And I think that one of the reasons we clamour over new gear is because we hope that this is the shortcut to getting great images. Rather than spending the time actually learning our craft, we hope that sticking on a new lens will instantly give us better images. And I'm sorry, it doesn't. So you can absolutely get great images with your kit lens and your entry-level camera. You just have to know how to use them. So here is my advice to you. Unless you are shooting in manual mode, you understand light, and you understand your other camera settings, I wouldn't clamour to get a new lens or a new camera body. I would do those things first. And then when you feel that you're being held back by your current equipment, you have my blessing to go and upgrade. Now, if you'd like to make this more actionable, then I have something for you. It's my free manual mode cheat sheet. That way you can take your first steps in manual mode and still be able to confidently set your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO settings. You'll find a link to this in the description underneath this video, or you can just copy the URL that you see on the screen right now. Once again, my name was Audrey-Anne from Live Snap Love. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. If you did, please leave a comment below or share it with someone who you think will benefit from it. I'll be back soon with another video tutorial, so I will see you again then.